Good afternoon, dear students. Today we are going to discuss the last three learning objectives of Module H, Economics, Finance, and Trade. So we are going to discuss about the liberal and mercantilist approaches to trade. We will also talk about the political interventions in trade, such as sanctions, autarky, and protectionism. I'm sure that you spoke about protectionism for economics, and we're going to explain the importance of regional and bilateral agreements, trade agreements. Okay, so you can find more information on the following sources. The main source I would suggest for you is Globalization of Foreign Politics, chapter 28, page 451, 463. Okay, so you can also find some specific websites about what is trade protectionism, what are multilateral trade agreements, advantages and disadvantages of World Trade Organization, which we discussed before, U.S. regional trade agreements, and so on. So what is the liberal and mercantilist approach to trade? The idea that, well, from the liberal perspective, we said that liberalism mainly focuses on the welfare state. It also focuses on the less intervention from the government on the economic affairs. So basically, the idea that Westphalian nation state is becoming too small for some things and too big for other things in an era of globalization resonates with many economic liberals. They argue that the nation state is pressured from above, in the sense that the global level or globalization creates cross-border activities which states are no longer able to control on their own, and this is why and this kind of economic transaction, this kind of economic activities mainly are linked mainly with the finance and environmental problems. Okay, and the nation state is also pressured from below in terms of the fact that local community is also more prone to collaborate and basically pushes for less control from the government. Okay, and another view of liberalism is that corporations would lose their national identity and they will focus more on their ambitions, and they will be the true economic players. Now, mercantilists on the other side actually formulated a view on globalization that rivals the economic liberal analysis. Mercantilists remain unconvinced that qualitative shift towards an economic global system has taken place. They do not believe that there is a phenomenon called globalization. They see economic globalization as more of the same process of intensified interdependence between national economies. Furthermore, they argue that trade and investment flows between the countries were at a high level before World War I. So, in other words, there is a little news in fact of economic interdependence. Mercantilists also reject the claim made by the economic liberals that corporations have lost their national identity because they remain tied with their home countries and they will mainly actually bring in financial contributions into their local economies, right? Mercantilists also reject the idea that nation states are being pressured and are somehow losing their process of economic globalization. They say that liberals fail to take into consideration the increased capacity of nation states to respond to the challenges of economic globalization. And they also reject, and they also say that technological development help to increase the state capacity for regulation and surveillance. Okay, so states are stronger than ever in their capacity to extract the economic surplus, such as taxes from their citizens. They're able to control and regulate all kind of activities in society, and this also increased dramatically. And in long term, sovereign states remains the preferred form of political organization around the world. So no serious competitor. So let's summarize what we just discussed before. Basically, economic liberal view states that economic globalization means a qualitative shift towards a global economic system, whereby the realist mercantilist view actually says that economic globalization is more of the same. Okay, for example, we're talking just about economic interdependence, but in terms of political regulations, the states are still strong actors. Economic globalization will bring increased prosperity to individuals, families, and companies, whereby the corporation says that, where the mercantilist view says that corporations do not lose their national identities. They're global players. They remain tied to their home countries, and they bring most of their revenues and actually support their own countries in terms of lobby and so on. And in this case, you guys should return to Module E and see how the lobby works and how does it affect foreign policy. From the perspective of economic liberalism, nation states lose power and influence, and because they're pressed from the above and from below. Whereby the realist mercantilist view supports the idea that nation states are not threatened by globalization. The state's capacity for regulation and surveillance increased rather than decreased. Okay. So, what are sanctions, autarky, and protectionism? I'm sure that you heard about protectionism when you discussed it for your economics course. And we're going to go, or let's say we're going to explain them one by one with some simple examples. Now, autarky is a quality of being self-sufficient. Usually the term is applied to political states or their economic systems. Autarky exists whenever an entity can survive its activities without external assistance or international trade. If a self-sufficient economy also refuses all trade with the outside world, then it is called a closed economy. Autarky is not necessarily an economic phenomenon. For example, a military autarky would be a state that could defend itself without help from another country, or could manufacture all its weapons without any imports from outside the world. Autarky can be said to be the policy of states or their entity when it seeks to be self-sufficient as a whole, but also can be limited to narrow fields such as possessions of key raw materials. For example, many countries have a policy of autarky with respect to foodstuffs and water for national security reasons. Right? So, for example, in terms of military autarky, we could say that U.S. has a policy of military autarky. In terms of being self-sufficient from the military perspective, we could also speak about Iran or Russia, or we could speak about North Korea. Okay. Now, so let's say that from historical perspective, mercantilist policies followed by Western European states from 16th to the 18th century actually could be called as an autarky, because most of these policies actually focused on limiting international trade. Okay. A more extensive form of autarky was supported by Nazi Germany between 1933 and 1945, which tried to maximize trades with its own economic bloc and to eliminate it with any outsiders. So basically, any trade was done between the Germany itself as the metropolis and any other colonies, or their own allies. Okay, A contemporary example of extreme autarky is North Korean system of Juche, or Korean self-reliance, and we discussed about North Korean autarkic system in module C when we discussed about the rogue states. Autarkic systems are actually opposite of the liberal economic system, which encourage the free flow of goods and services. So basically, Adam Smith in 18th century was one of the first modern thinkers to question the benefits of autarkic policies. So he argued that mercantilist policies followed by British Empire were determined to economic growth, and that a free trade system in which countries specialized in producing of the goods in which they held an absolute advantage would generate more wealth. So in 19th century British economist David Ricardo, considered the founder of modern international trade theory, took Smith's study a step further by showing that if countries engaged in international trade by specializing in the goods in which they held a comparative advantage, then they could be guaranteed gains for trade for all parties, regardless of the size of the economies involved. Okay, and there are a lot of other theoretical studies which you can actually find on ResearchGate or academia. So in 1966, the United States Nation Security Council took a historic step by imposing its first set of comprehensive sanctions in its 21 years of existence, and they were enforced the sanctions to undermine Jan Smith's white supremacist regime in Rhodesia, and then were followed soon with another set of comprehensive UN sanctions in 1977 in response to South Africa's apartheid system. Okay. We also have discussed the sanctions as an outcome and a main cause for the Gulf War II. And you might want to return to module C, C1, to actually review the consequences of the Gulf War I in terms of sanctions. So sanctions themselves can take different forms, right? They might involve tariffs, which would be taxes imposed on goods which are imported from another country. Quotas, a limit of how many goods can be either imported from another country or sent to that country. Embargoes, a trade restriction that prevents a country from trading with another. For example, a government can prevent its citizens or business from providing goods or services to another country. And we have an example of embargo imposed to Qatar a couple of years ago by its neighbors in by Saudi Arabia and Emirates, Bahrain, and so on. Okay, non-tariff barriers are non-tariff restrictions on imposed goods and can include also licensing or packaging requirements, product standards, and other requirements that are not specifically a tax. Asset freezes or seizures involve preventing assets owned by a country or individual from being sold or moved to or outside the country that imposes the sanction. Then we also have arms and related materials embargo, which aims to prevent weapons and military equipment from leaving or reaching a targeted country. It also prohibits exporting and importing arms and related arm-related materials and from the targeted country, and may also prohibit communicating technical data or financial transactions related to military activities. Asset freeze aims to prevent an individual or entity from gaining access to the property or other assets. I discussed it before. And export-import restriction aim to hinder the economy or specific sectors of economy. For example, oil and petroleum products or certain telecommunication products. Now, we also can categorize sanctions by the number of parties issuing the sanctions. So we have unilateral sanctions, where a single country is enacting the sanction. Unilateral sanctions are more risky but can be effective if enacted by an economically powerful country. Bilateral sanctions, a group of or block of countries is supporting sanction use. Bilateral sanctions are considered less risky because no one country is on the line for the sanctions result. So we could say that, for example, the sanctions imposed or embargo imposed to Qatar by its neighbors in the Middle East are bilateral sanctions as well. Another way to categorize sanctions is by the type of trade they limit. So export sanctions block goods flowing into a country. Import sanctions involve block goods leaving the country. So we can have financial prohibitions and technical assistance prohibitions as well. So from financial perspective, the sanctions might involve prohibition of person of a nation state from conducting financial transactions. The country can also impose sanctions on a certain list of people. So, for example, after the Ukrainian crisis emerged in the Eastern Europe, U.S. imposed a sanction on a list of Russian billionaires as a response to Russian involvement in Donbass conflict. Technical assistance prohibition aim to prevent a country targeted by an arms embargo or an export ban from obtaining services and information related to banned products. They typically prohibit providing technical data, training, or other technical assistance. What would be the main reasons a country would choose to impose the sanctions? So basically, it might be as a retaliatory measure for another country's economic activities. For example, a steel producing country might use a sanction if another country tries to protect a newly steel industry by putting an import quota on foreign steel. And we saw it, we saw this kind of behavior from in U.S.-China trade wars in the past couple of years. Deterrent to human rights abuses. So basically, for for example, U.S. sanctions against apartheid in South Africa, United Nations might actually use bilateral sanctions against a country if it notices that human rights are not actually abused. Another reason to impose sanctions would be to alter target countries' policies. So basically, countries would actually be willing to punish, like the countries would actually be aware that they would have some economic problems, but they are actually aiming to target another country. So the cost of the threat is less than a military intervention, but still carries economic weight. For example, in 2003, Zimbabwe's president, Robert Mugabe, and his inner circle were sanctioned by US because of alleged rights abuses. Okay. Sometimes the countries impose sanctions for domestic reasons rather than international ones. So basically, sometimes nationalism and one country's government can use sanctions as a way to demonstrate or to create a distraction from domestic trouble. So because of this problem, WTO seek to relieve some of the pressure and create panels to review disputes between the countries. And we discussed about WTO and the panels, Uruguay panels and other panels in our previous slide. What could be some impacts? Okay, so countries' products are not purchased abroad. This could have a very negative effect. The sanction might cause a sort of political and economic instability. This might result in more totalitarian regime. It can create a failed state due to a power vacuum. The targeted country's suffering is ultimately borne by its citizens, who in times of crisis might solidify the regime in charge rather than overthrow it. So, for example, if we return back to Module C1, when we discussed about the consequences of the Gulf War I, and then later on in Module C, Learning Objective C8, we also discussed about the reasons for the second Gulf War to emerge. We could actually say that the reasons why the Saddam Hussein's regime actually gained more popularity in Iraq between the first Gulf War and the second Gulf War were actually those sanctions that were imposed by the international community, mainly U.S. Okay. Sometimes the sanctions might have unintended consequences. For example, OPEC issued an embargo on oil shipments to the United States in '73 as a punishment for resupplying Israel with arms. So OPEC was using the embargo as a tool for foreign policy, but the effects spilled over and actually affected the world stock market crash and created the world stock market crash in '73-'74. The inflow of capital from higher oil prices resulted in an arms race in Middle Eastern countries, and that was a destabilizing problem, and did not result in a policy change envisioned by OPEC. In addition, many embargoed countries cut back on oil consumption and required more efficient use of petroleum products for further cutting demand. Another impact of sanctions are the increased costs to consumers and businesses in countries that issue sanctions. Okay, so basically the targeted country is unable to purchase goods, resulting in economic loss through unemployment as well as production loss. In many it might also reduce the choice of goods and services that domestic consumers have, and it might increase the cost of business for companies that must look elsewhere for supplies. Okay. So if a sanction is used is a unilateral sanctions, the target country can actually use a third party country to impose another set of sanctions, right? We could actually, as an example here, we could actually think of the embargo imposed on Qatar as, let's say, at the first phase of the embargo, certain goods and services simply disappeared for the market, so the country or the businesses had to actually look for support from outside in order to ensure the supply of goods and services. The lack of Qatar is that it actually had enough. It actually has a strong economy, and it allowed it to stabilize in quite a short time. So some international documents which you could use as part of your essays, and you can just you can list them as part of your essays, is United Nations Act, Special Economic Measures Act, Justice for Victims of Corrupt Official, Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, Export and Import Permit Act, and Freezing of Assets in Corrupt Foreign officials. Okay, so most of these documents and regulating documents which regulate sanctions are actually under the monitoring of United Nations and WTO. So basically, the success of sanctions varies in accordance with how many parties are involved. Bilateral sanctions are more effective than unilateral ones. In many circumstances, the sanctions cause economic harm without changing the target country's policies. Sanctions are actually blunt tools of foreign policy because their deployment is rarely precise enough to affect only the targeted country and normally has a domino effect for the entire economy. Now, another way to control another policy or another policies which aim to affect the decisions of other countries and part of foreign policy is the trade protectionism. Okay, so trade protectionism represents a policy that limits unfair competition for foreign industries. It is a politically motivated defensive measure. It works well in short term, but it's very destructive in long term. It makes the industries less competitive in international trade. Countries use various methods to protect their trade, enact tariffs that tax imports. Government subsidizes local industries, impose quotas on imported goods. Deliberate attempt in the country to lower its currency values. So let's go one by one. So by enacting the tariffs that tax imports, and this action would immediately raise the price of the imported goods. They become less competitive compared to local goods. This method works the best for countries with a lot of imports, like US, for example. Okay, so for example, Smoot-Hawley Act in 1930, it was designed to protect farmers from agricultural import from Europe, which was stepping up farming after the destruction of World War. But by the time the bill made it a competitive trade war, restricted global trade. So it was one of the reasons for the extended severity of Great Depression. So if you would, so basically the protectionism has long-term impacts. Now, another type of protectionism or another action of protectionism is subsidies of the government to the local industries. Subsidies, as you might know from economics, are a form of tax credits or even direct payments that allows producers to lower the price of local goods and services, makes the products cheaper even when shipped overseas. That means subsidies work even better than tariffs. This method works best for countries that rely mainly on exports, but sometimes subsidies can have the opposite effect. A good example, once again, is the U.S. agricultural industry. The Agricultural Adjustment Act in 1933 allowed the government to pay farmers not to grow crops or livestock. That would allow their fields to rest and regain nutrients. It also restricted supply, which increased the prices. It helped farmers devastated by the Dust Bowl, but made food even more expensive for consumers. By imposing quotas on imported goods, this method is more effective than the first two. No matter how low a foreign country sets the price for subsidies, it can ship more goods. Another method is a deliberate attempt of the country to lower its currency value. This would make its export cheaper and more competitive. This method can result in retaliation and start a currency war. One way the countries can lower their currency value through a fixed exchange rate. This actually we could actually say as an example the China's yuan. And another way is to create so much national debt that it has the same effect like the US dollar decline. Now, advantages and disadvantages of protectionism. From advantages, if a country is trying to grow strong in a new industry, tariffs will protect them from foreign competitors. It may gives new industries develop competitive advantages. So, for example, China uses cost leadership. It exports low-cost products at a reasonable quality level. It can do this because its standard of living is lower, so it can pay its workers less. It also fixes the value of its currency, the yuan, as at a value lower than the dollar. Japan also changed its competitive advantage in the 1960s. It was a cost leader that excelled at cheap electronics. By the 1980s. It had shifted up the differentiation and in quality brands such as Lexus, for example. Temporarily create jobs for domestic workers. The protection of tariffs, quotas, and subsidies allows domestic companies to hire locally rather than look for some cheap workforce outside the country. This benefit ends once other countries retaliate by erecting their own protectionism. From disadvantages, in long-term trade protectionism weakens the industry. Without competition, companies within the industry have no need to innovate, and that actually generates a monopolistic market. Eventually, domestic products will decline in quality. It will be a lower quality and more expensive than that foreign competitors produce. For example, job outsourcing is a result of why U.S. competitiveness declined. Competition has declined from decades of the United States not investing in education. This is particularly true for the high-tech, engineering, and science. So basically, that's it about advantages and disadvantages. Now, we are going to also discuss about the importance of regional and bilateral trade agreements. There are three types of trade agreements: unilateral trade agreements, bilateral trade agreements, and multilateral trade agreements. Unilateral trade agreements occurs when a country imposes trade restrictions on another country and no other country reciprocates. Country can also unilaterally loosen trade restrictions, but that rarely happens. It would put the country at a competitive advantage. For example, US and other developed countries only do this as a type of foreign aid. They want to help emerging markets to strengthen certain industries. The foreign industry is too small to be a threat. Now, bilateral trade agreements are agreements signed between two countries. Both countries agree to loosen trade restrictions, expand business opportunities between them. The sticking point usually centers around key protected or subsidized domestic industries. For example, for most countries, these are the automotive, oil, or food production industries. The US has 16 bilateral agreements, and bilateral trade agreement confers favored trading status between two nations. So each agreement covers 5 areas. First, it eliminates tariffs and other taxes. This gives companies within both countries a price advantage. Countries agree they will not dump products at a cheap cost. The governments refrain from using unfair subsidies. The agreement standardizes regulations, labor standards, and environmental protections. Okay, they also agree not to steal from the others and innovate products by adopting each other's copyright and intellectual property right. And if you remember, we discussed this part in our last lesson. Advantages and disadvantages of bilateral trade agreements. From advantages, we can say bilateral trade agreements increase trade between the two countries. They open markets to successful industries as companies benefit and they add jobs. The country's consumers also benefit by lower costs. They are easier to negotiate, and this means that can go in effect even faster. Disadvantages: any trade agreement will cause less successful companies to go out of business. They can't compete with a more powerful industry in a foreign country. When protective tariffs are removed, they lose their price advantages. Bilateral trade agreements can also trigger competing bilateral agreements between other countries. So, US, as I said, has bilateral trade agreements with Australia, Bahrain, Chile, Colombia, Israel, Jordan, Korea, Morocco, Oman, Panama, Peru, and Singapore. Now, in order to discuss about a bilateral trade agreement and partnership, we could actually discuss the transatlantic trade and investment partnership negotiated between the European Union and the US. So basically, this is a free trade agreement between two of the world's largest economies. They are the United States, which produced $18 trillion in 2016, and European Union, which produced around $19 trillion. The two economies generate almost a third of the world's GDP. The total amount traded is already $1 trillion, but the transatlantic trade and investment partnership could actually can increase this amount 4 times. Okay. So the importance of the EU is even greater for foreign direct investment. European companies accounted around $1.5 trillion or 63% of total FDI in the United States. American companies accounted 1.7 trillion or 50% of FDI in Europe in 2009. These investments use 4 million workers on both sides of Atlantic, and that's how many are employed by affiliates of European or US-based companies. For example, German company Siemens employs 60,000 people in the United States. General Electric employs 70,000 workers in Europe. Pros and cons of transatlantic trade and investment partnership. Greater growth would create jobs and prosperity for both areas. Some industries would benefit more than others. An agreement would strengthen geopolitical relations between the two major economies. If the US and EU could actually remove the differences, they could stand as a united front against the threats from the rest of the world. From the cons, we can say that many industries could suffer from increased competition from Europe that might result in fewer jobs for American workers. These disadvantages go with any trade agreement. For example, European agricultural business would suffer from cheaper American-made food products. Both governments would have to stop protecting industries such as French champagne or Boeing, an American plane, or Boeing is in the fierce global competition against France's Airbus. Okay. Opportunities. One scenario to overcome the obstacles can include negotiations on the idea that remaining tariffs could be eliminated. However, this could not have much of an economic impact since tariffs are already low. The biggest obstacle in protected status of each country's agribusiness. They all receive government subsidies. So the EU bans all genetically modified crops, and that would actually, and we know that US is one of the main producers of the genetically modified crops. And there are many smaller issues. For example, Greece requires any cheese labeled feta to be made from sheep or goats. US dairies made feta cheese from cow's milk. Multilateral trade agreements, or regional trade agreements, or international trade agreements. Okay, so these are the most difficult to negotiate. These are among 3 countries or more. The greater the numbers of participants, the more difficult the negotiations are. They're also more complex since each country has its own needs and requests. Okay, so basically one of the largest multilateral agreement is the North American Free Trade Agreement between US, Canada, and Mexico. Their combined economic output is around 20 trillion. Okay, so NAFTA basically is one of the biggest regional trade agreements. Okay, so pros and cons. For the pros, signatories of the treat each other the same. That means that no country can give a better trade deals to another country. It increases trade for every participant. Standardization of commerce regulation for all trade participants. Companies would save legal costs since they follow the same rules for each economy. Countries can also negotiate trade deals with more than one country at a time, and making emerging markets stronger helps develop economy over time and lead to middle-class population growth. From the negative sides of the multilateral trade agreements, they're very complex. The details of negotiation are particular to trade and business practices. Some companies and regions of the country suffer when the trade borders disappear, for example.